Interior, and possibly the exterior as well, was covered with brightly colored plaster, with scenes of hunting and other activities garishly painted in blues, yellows, reds, and other colors on the walls. The king would have sat at one side of a large room, surrounded by such painted scenes, while a large fire blazed in a hearth that was set in the middle of the floor. It was dark in there, and smoky, and probably damp as well. Mycenaean palaces seem to have been a bit claustrophobic. With few windows or other openings, they focused inward rather than looking outward. The rooms around the palace were used for a multitude of things, ranging from what were probably residential quarters for the royal family to workrooms for the craftsmen. There appears to have been a cult center, possibly where religious rituals took place. Some strange idols and figurines have been found there, along with wall paintings. Texts inscribed on clay tablets also have been found at various places in and around the palace, as they have at other Mycenaean palatial sites. They are written in Linear B, which was deciphered and translated in 1952 by Michael Ventris, an English architect, who proved that it was an early version of Greek. Most of the tablets are simply inventories of goods that were being brought to the palace or sent out from there, but they do include some of the names of their gods, who will be quite familiar to readers, including Zeus, Hera, Poseidon, Artemis, and Dionysus. There is no doubt that Mycenae was a wealthy city, with international connections. Objects imported from Italy, Egypt, Canaan, Cyprus, Anatolia, and even as far away as Mesopotamia have been found. Some of the most interesting are fragments of Egyptian faience plaques with the name of Pharaoh Amenhotep III on them, which might have been left by an official Egyptian embassy that was sent to Mycenae in the middle of the 14th century BCE. Late in the Bronze Age, possibly about 1250 BC, at the same time as the Lion Gate, a well-constructed tunnel with steps of stone was built, leading down to a water source so that the inhabitants didn't have to venture outside in times of siege. This may be an indication that they could see trouble brewing in the near future. It is not clear why the city came to an end soon after 1200 BCE, but it did, in the general calamity that ended the whole of the Late Bronze. Revealing the first Greeks 137. Age in this region. Mycenae is built directly over a seismic fault line, and at least one earthquake, if not more, caused destruction during this period. But it may have been drought and famine, followed perhaps by either internal revolt or external invasion, that finally brought down this once great city. There are some later remains, including a temple dedicated to Hera that was built at the very top of the citadel after the 8th century BCE, during the Archaic period, but Mycenae never regained its lost glory. Other Mycenaean palaces at Tiryns, Thebes, Pylos, and elsewhere in Greece were destroyed or abandoned at the end of the Late Bronze Age as well. Much remains to be excavated at these and other sites, as shown by the recent discovery of the so-called Griffin warrior grave at Pylos in 2015 by a team of University of Cincinnati archaeologists led by Jack Davis and Sharon Stocker. Dating to the 15th century BC and located just next to the so-called Palace of Nestor at the site, the tomb contained more than 1,400 objects accompanying the single male skeleton, a man who was about 30 to 35 years old when he died. Preliminary announcements and media reports list some of the artifacts buried with him: gold rings, necklaces, and other jewelry, gold cups, silver cups, and bronze bowls, a bronze mirror, ivory combs, and carved sealstones, and a long bronze sword with an ivory hilt covered in gold leaf. Between his legs was an ivory plaque inscribed with a carved griffin on it, which has now given its name to the grave and its warrior. The grave was so packed with delicate artifacts that the archaeologists dug with wooden shish kebab sticks instead of metal dental tools, to be sure that no damage was done to them during excavation. PPPP. Partway across the Aegean Sea, on the island of Crete, Schliemann also tried to purchase land at a site that he thought might be the capital city of the legendary King Minos. The owner refused to sell it to him, and so it was left to another archaeologist 2 decades later, Arthur Evans, to excavate the site and bring the other great Bronze Age Aegean civilization, the Minoans, to light. The city that he excavated, beginning in 1900, is now known as Knossos. 138 Chapter 8. Evans was a Victorian gentleman in every sense of the word. In one picture, Evans can be seen clad in a white linen suit and wearing a pith helmet, which is of course not at all the way that we dress when digging today. Born in 1851, he grew up in good circumstances in England, the son of John Evans, who was a respected scholar and a trustee of the British Museum, as well as president of the Society of Antiquaries, the Numismatic Society, the Geological Society of London, and other societies and institutes. Evans had been searching for this city of Knossos for years, ever since he saw a few items for sale in the marketplace in Athens earlier in the decade. Known as milkstones and sold to pregnant women for help during and after giving birth, these small pieces of semi-precious stone had strange figures and engravings on them. Evans eventually traced them back to Crete, to Kephala Hill on the outskirts of the modern port city of Heraklion, the very land that Schliemann had tried unsuccessfully to buy. Evans had better luck, purchased the mound, and began excavating. Underneath the gentle hill covered by underbrush and trees, his team of workers quickly came across the ruins of what Evans identified as the palace that he was looking for. He spent the rest of his career, and virtually all his family fortune, digging at the site, publishing the results, and reconstructing the remains. What Evans found at Knossos turned out to be a civilization that was a little older than the Mycenaeans and that had influenced them when they were growing up. For instance, a number of the objects that Schliemann found in the shaft graves at Mycenae were either of Minoan manufacture or bore the stamp of Minoan influence. In fact, Evans thought that the Minoans had conquered the Mycenaeans, though the opposite has turned out to be true. When we refer to the Minoans, we're using the name that Evans gave to this people, since we don't know what they called themselves, nor do we know where they originally came from. They had flourished at the end of the 3rd millennium BCE and then through most of the 2nd millennium BCE, what we now call the Middle and Late Bronze Age in this region. Around 1700 BCE, a major earthquake hit Knossos, but the inhabitants survived and rebuilt the palace. Probably sometime about 1350 BCE, the Mycenaeans from the Greek mainland seem to have invaded and taken over, bringing with them a new way of revealing the first Greeks 139. Writing, new types of scenes for the wall paintings, and a more militaristic way of life that lasted for about a century and a half, until everything collapsed soon after 1200 BCE. Evans found amazing things at Knossos, but he also made what many consider to be a fatal error, because of the reconstructions that he created from the remains. For example, he imagined that the main part of the palace had 3 stories, which he inferred from the remains of staircases that he found, and so he reconstructed that part of the palace with 3 floors. Because he used cement and other permanent materials, it is nearly impossible to undo his reconstruction today. He may well have been correct in part, but not in everything, which is why today such reconstructions are generally not permitted, unless there is a very clear indication of what is original and what has been reconstructed. What Evans and his team of workers found was a large, essentially open-air palace, with a huge central courtyard. It was light, it was airy, it was open to the elements, it was integrated into the environment. It even had running water and a sewer system. In other words, it was a building belonging to a culture that was very technologically advanced for its time. It served not only as headquarters for the ruler, but also as a center for redistribution. Locals would bring their goods in for storage, like wheat, barley, wine, and grapes, and then the palace would redistribute them as needed. There is, in fact, an entire part of the palace that consists only of corridors packed with large storage jars, including some that are sunk into the ground, in order to keep their contents cold. 2 things remain a mystery, however. One is the fact that there are absolutely no fortification walls around the palace at Knossos. Nor are there any at the other 6 or 7 smaller palaces elsewhere on Crete at this time, despite occasional claims to the contrary. This is strange. Why weren't the people on Crete afraid of being attacked? Much later, the Greek historian Thucydides said that the Minoans had a thalassocracy, that is, they ruled the sea with their navy. But that explains only why they might not have been worried about invasions by outsiders. It doesn't clarify why they weren't worried about an attack from just down the road. There have been many ideas put forward, but none has been completely satisfactory. One hypothesis is that it was a 140 Chapter 8 single family that was ruling Crete at the time, with the father at Knossos, his sons living at other palaces like Phaistos and Kato-Zakro, and cousins at still other palaces like Chania. It also has been suggested that perhaps women ruled Crete as a matriarchy, and that their peaceful rule made fortifications unnecessary. Although this could certainly be true, it still doesn't explain why there are no fortification walls: Zenobia of Palmyra, Boudica of Celtic England, Cleopatra of Egypt, and other female leaders throughout the centuries and elsewhere in the ancient world serve as proof that women are as capable as men of fighting or leading attacks on other cities and regions. But that brings us to the second mystery, for we have no idea whether it was a king who ruled Knossos. It might have been a queen. It might have been a priest or a priestess. It might have been community rule. We just don't know. The archaeological remains, the artifacts, and even the written texts found at the site are all ambiguous and do not yet allow us to answer the question of who ruled at Knossos. Evans did label one room the king's throne room and another the queen's megaron, but those are just names that he assigned. Someone was in charge, but we're still not sure who it was. Among the objects brought to light by Evans are two extremely well-known figurines of women holding snakes. They are made out of faience and ivory, but they were very fragmentary when found and so were restored by skilled craftsmen hired by Evans. The larger one is frequently called the snake goddess and the smaller one the snake priestess, but the names also are often used interchangeably, and it is not at all clear whether either of them really is a representation of a goddess or a priestess. There are now a number of such figurines in museums around the world. Unfortunately, only a few are likely to be genuine. The rest have been identified as forgeries, probably made by the very men who conserved and reconstructed the real ones for Evans. The interior walls of the palace were ablaze with color, in the form of many wall paintings. Everywhere the inhabitants looked, there was another elaborate decoration. From these, we can tell a fair amount about the Minoans. For instance, there is one woman depicted who is so beautiful that Evans dubbed her La Parisienne. She is shown with an elaborate hairdo, makeup, jewelry, and a dress of red, white, and blue. Other frescoes show similarly dressed women. Men are pictured too. Revealing the first Greeks 141. Usually dressed only in a kilt, they too wear jewelry and possibly makeup as well. There are a few frescoes, though, where the reconstructions of Evans and his team of restorers were downright wrong. One is the well-known dolphin fresco, another is the most famous painting at the site, the Priest King fresco. In the dolphin fresco, Evans reconstructed a painting with 5 dolphins and a few flying fish on a wall in the area of the Queen's megaron. The painting wasn't still on the wall, of course. Evans found the fragments lying in the dirt in front of the wall during his excavations. He only found fragments from 2 of the dolphins, but the area where he thought the painting had been was large enough that he needed to suggest that there had originally been 5 dolphins. The philosophical principle of Occam's razor, that the simplest solution is probably the correct one, comes into play here, though. If Evans found fragments from 2 dolphins, then he can only state for certain that there were 2 dolphins originally. Everything else is a hypothesis. And since the painting could have come from anywhere in the room, or even from the one above it, we should look around for other possibilities. In 1986, Professor Robert Cole of Hunter College suggested that the dolphin fresco, with only 2 dolphins, rather than 5, was originally on the floor, not on the wall. For there is a space on the floor that is just a perfect size for the existing painting of the 2 dolphins, and both the Minoans and the Mycenaeans are known to have painted at least some of their floors. It is also conceivable that it was originally inlaid into the floor of a room located directly above the present one and it came crashing down after the palace was abandoned. The other painting that Evans reconstructed incorrectly is the Priest King fresco, which today is reproduced everywhere, from the covers of books to placemats to plaster replicas. Here, Evans and his restorers put together a man whom they called the Priest King of Knossos, though we should note that the title implies that they were unsure of who was ruling the city, just as we are still uncertain today. They have him walking toward the left side of the painting, with his head and his legs facing to the left, but with his body frontally facing the viewer and twisted toward the right. His right arm is cocked up against his chest, while his 142 Chapter 8 left arm goes off to the right, holding a rope. So, what's wrong with this? Well, just about everything. First, the pieces apparently were found in 3 different rooms in the building, not all together in one. Why Evans thought they were all from the same painting is beyond me. Second, the flesh of the figure is in two different colors. The head, which is facing left and has just a bit of skin visible, is painted white. The chest, which is twisted right, is reddish-brown, and the legs, which are headed to the left, are also reddish-brown. In Minoan art, they used conventions to depict males and females. Males are always red or brown, females are white or yellow. In other words, we have three different figures here, which Evans put together as a single person. We have a woman headed left, of whom we have only the top of her head, a man also headed left, from whom we have only part of his legs, and perhaps a young boy or teenager headed right, for whom we have only the torso, with the right hand cocked against the chest. Moreover, the pose of the torso looks very much like the pose adopted by two boxing boys in a painting found on Santorini. So much for the priest king of Knossos, but this serves as a good reminder that archaeology and archaeological reconstructions are always open to correction by later researchers. PPPP. Let's now turn from Evans's reconstructed frescoes and have a quick look at the big central court at Knossos. This was undoubtedly used for all sorts of things, as such big ceremonial areas are throughout the world and in all eras. But the court at Knossos seems to have been where a rather unusual practice took place, if we can believe what is pictured in a small wall painting in one of the buildings, where we see three people, one male and two female, leaping over a bull. The man is in mid-flight, doing a somersault over the bull's back. One woman is in front of the bull, grasping his horns, perhaps to distract him, while the other is behind the bull and looks poised to catch the man when he lands. It is also possible, however, that all three are leaping over the bull. If so, one woman has just landed, the man is in the process, and the other woman is about to fling herself over. It is revealing the first Greeks 143. Unclear which interpretation is the correct one. Either way, this is like doing a routine on the pommel horse at the Olympics, except that the pommel horse is alive, has horns, and is trying to kill you. Excavators at Knossos also found an ivory figurine, which may be part of a bull leaping group. The figure is most likely meant to have been positioned flying through the air, for it has pointed toes as well as outstretched arms. Beyond that, there are several bulls' heads made in stone that have been found at Knossos, some of which appear to have been deliberately smashed, perhaps after a ritual. These stone heads were hollow, with holes at the nostrils, so that if they were filled with red wine, for instance, and then held at the proper angle, it would look like the participant was holding the head of a bull that had just been sacrificed to the gods and was still dripping blood. PPPP. And so, it seems that the Minoans were perhaps doing some bull leaping in their central courtyard as well as some rituals involving bulls in or around the palace. This in turn brings to mind the Greek myth of Theseus and the Minotaur. Back in the Bronze Age, King Minos demanded a sacrifice each year to the Minotaur, the half-man half-bull creature who was living in the basement below his palace at Knossos. The basement was a labyrinth, from which no one had ever gotten out alive. Each year the king of Athens had to send 7 young boys and 7 girls to King Minos, who then sent them down into the labyrinth. One year Theseus, the son of the king of Athens, volunteered to go, so that he could try to kill the Minotaur and put an end to the annual sacrifice. His distraught father agreed. Once he got to Knossos, Theseus befriended Ariadne, the daughter of King Minos. She provided him with a sword and a ball of string. As he went through the maze, he unwound the ball of string, so that he could find his way back out. When he got to the Minotaur, he pulled out the sword and cut off the Minotaur's head. He then retraced his steps and emerged victorious. I have long thought that the story may have been created in an attempt by later occupants of the area to explain the ruins of the palace. 144 Chapter 8 of Knossos, as well as to account for the vague memories that they had about their ancestors doing something with bulls, and especially the maze-like appearance of the ruined storage areas. I may be completely wrong about that, however, and there might be another explanation entirely, because in the early 1990s, a huge wall painting was found, depicting multiple bulls and numerous bull leapers in action in front of what can only be described as a maze or a labyrinth. It is a painting that we would understandably expect to find at Knossos, except that's not where it is. It's not even in Crete. It is, in fact, in the Nile Delta region of Egypt, at the site of Tel El Dabeh. And it dates somewhere between the 17th and 15th centuries BC, that is, right in the middle of the second millennium, during the Bronze Age and the height of Minoan culture. Therefore, it may be that the myth of Theseus and the Minotaur has some kernel of truth in Minoan practice and was not made up later to explain the ruins of Knossos. But the very fact that such a painting is in Egypt, even though it depicts a Minoan motif and was created using techniques that were quite different from those of the Egyptians at that time, is to my mind even more interesting. The excavator of the painting suggested that perhaps a Minoan princess had been brought over for a dynastic marriage. I don't think it is necessary to have such an elaborate explanation, but certainly the presence of the painting shows that Egypt and Crete were in direct contact at that time. I suspect that it was created either by Minoan artists or by local artists who had been trained by Minoans. We already knew from other evidence that such connections existed, but it is fascinating to find such a vivid corroboration of the international connections that were ongoing across the Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean during the Bronze Age, more than 3,000 years ago. PPPP. Schliemann is usually given credit for discovering the Mycenaeans on mainland Greece, and Evans usually gets credit for discovering the Minoans on Crete. But there is another group that flourished in the Aegean region during the Bronze Age, on the Cycladic Islands that lay north of Crete and east of mainland Greece. Revealing the first Greeks 145. These islands, including Naxos, Paros, Melos, Thera, and others, had their own Cycladic culture, albeit with many interconnections with the Mycenaeans and Minoans. They are probably best known for the marble figurines from the early Cycladic period, during the 3rd millennium BCE, which depict primarily women, but also figures playing musical instruments such as a double pipe and what may be a harp or lyre. At least some of them were involved in the international connections that were ongoing a bit later during the 2nd millennium BCE, including the island of Thera, perhaps better known today as Santorini. We shall discuss those events in the next chapter. In 2011, a documentary called Finding Atlantis aired on television, in which a team was said to be searching for the remains of the lost island in an area of Spain, just north of Cadiz. Most archaeologists whom I know, and a number of other viewers as well, found the results less than compelling. It seems that almost every year, there is an announcement made that someone has located the lost island of Atlantis, perhaps in the Bahamas or off the coast of Cyprus. Sometimes a television show results, sometimes a book is published. Personally, I think the island is in plain sight, and always has been, for I, and many other archaeologists, suspect that if there is any kernel of truth underlying the myth of Atlantis at all, it is probably the volcanic Greek island of Thera, also called Santorini, which erupted during the middle of the 2nd millennium BCE. We'll return to this possible relationship in a bit, but first we should look at the actual excavations and discoveries that have taken place on the island since 1967. PPPP 9. Finding Atlantis? Finding Atlantis, 147. Santorini lies about 70 miles north of Crete. The name Santorini is rather recent. It was the Venetians who gave the island that name, after Saint Irene. An older name, frequently used by archaeologists, is Thera, which the Greek historian Herodotus says comes from the name of a Spartan commander named Theras, who was the leader of a colony established there during the 1st millennium BCE. Even before that, the island was called Calliste, meaning the beautiful one or fair one, which Herodotus said was the name that the Phoenicians gave to the island. Some suggest that the very first name of the island may have been Strongylai, which translates as the round one and which makes sense, since it is circular in shape. It is actually a volcano and is still active today. Sometime during the middle of the 2nd millennium, most likely in either the 17th or 16th century BC, the volcano blew its top, scattering ash and pumice primarily to the south and east. This eruption of Santorini 148 Chapter 9 would have been during a time when the Minoans were flourishing on Crete and may have dramatically affected their civilization, either for the short or the long term. The explosion is said to have been 4 or 5 times more forceful than the most powerful volcanic eruption in modern times, the explosion of Krakatoa in Indonesia, which took place about 130 years ago, in 1883. Archaeologists and geologists have found the pumice from the Santorini eruption in excavations and at the bottoms of lakes in places ranging from Crete to Egypt to Turkey. The entire middle part of the island is completely gone as a result of the explosion, with only the outer part remaining as an incomplete circle of land. The circle is broken in 2 places, which is where tons of water rushed in from the Aegean Sea to fill up the caldera that is hundreds of feet deep. That in turn most likely created a tidal wave or tsunami that affected places as far away as Crete. Huge blocks of stone can still be seen on the beach by the site of Amnisos, where they had probably been thrown out of place by the disaster. In the middle of the caldera today are several small islands that have popped up just in the last century as a result of the continuing, low-level volcanic activity. Today tourists can take a boat out to these little islands and hike on them. I can personally attest that the rocks are so hot that the heat can be felt through the soles of your shoes and everything stinks of sulfur, with an odor of rotting eggs. It is a unique, and not entirely pleasant, experience, but it is memorable. The eruption also completely buried the Bronze Age city of Akrotiri, which is frequently called the Pompeii of the Aegean because of the deep ash layer that completely covered and preserved it. In some places on the island, the ash layer is so thick that it is quarried today, for use in things like cement. The ash fall filled the houses at Akrotiri, preserving some to the second story. Just as at Pompeii, it is as if life simply stopped here in a single instant, more than 3,500 years ago. PPPP. With or without the myth of Atlantis, excavations at the site of Akrotiri have shed very interesting and important light upon life in the Bronze Age Aegean, because the eruption took place at a time when the Finding Atlantis, 149. Inhabitants, as well as the Minoans from nearby Crete, were engaged in regular contact and international trade with places like Egypt and Canaan in the eastern Mediterranean. It is clear from some of the remains found during the excavations that the site may have been nearly abandoned before the time of the final eruption. There are indications that a major earthquake, or perhaps multiple earthquakes, may have hit the island about a decade before the final destruction. At least some of the inhabitants had tried to repair the damage, though many may have already fled at the first sign of trouble. Today we know that earthquakes frequently precede eruptions. The ancients may have known that as well. Because no bodies or other human remains and only a few precious objects have been found despite nearly 50 years of excavation, it is in fact quite likely that most of the inhabitants cleared out before the end finally came, taking their most valuable and easily transportable belongings with them. But they still left behind plenty of things for us to find. The Greek archaeologist Spiridon Marinatos gets credit for discovering the site, but it wasn't all that hard to find. A portion of the site was in a gully, down which water flowed every time it rained. That water had washed away much of the ash in that area, so that some pieces of the site could be readily seen. The excavations began in 1967. Marinatos had wanted to start such excavations for nearly 30 years, ever since he published an article in the journal Antiquity in 1939. In that article, he had suggested that the Minoan civilization on Crete had been brought to an end, or at least was dramatically and adversely affected, by an eruption of Santorini at some point during the 2nd millennium BCE. It was such a radical suggestion that the editors agreed to publish the article only if they were allowed to add in a note at the beginning, suggesting that he should undertake excavations in order to test his hypothesis. Marinatos directed the Akrotiri excavations from 1967 until 1974, when he died at the site. The official verdict was that his death was caused by a massive stroke, resulting in him tumbling off the balk into a trench. He is buried at the site, but in true archaeological fashion, I am told that it took several efforts before a proper grave could be dug, because they kept hitting remains from the ancient site. I should note that there are similar problems when trying to place the supporting 150 Chapter 9 posts every time a new roofing system is installed, because they keep hitting ancient remains when digging the holes for the posts. Marinatos made discoveries at the ancient site from the very first day that he began digging. The excavations continued after his death and are today led by the well-known archaeologist Christos Domas. Even though the site has been continuously excavated for nearly 50 years at this point, it is estimated that only a small percentage of the ancient town has been uncovered. In many places, a situation similar to that seen at Pompeii was encountered, in which the original wood or other organic material had decomposed and otherwise disappeared, leaving an empty space in the now hardened volcanic ash. Into these spaces, excavators have poured cement or plaster of Paris, which is then colored brown, to imitate the original wood. In this way, the buildings remained preserved up to their second story and sometimes beyond, just as Marinatos and Domas found them, and are still rendered safe for both the tourists and the archaeologists who wander among them. The architectural continuity of Santorini is such that if the ruins were painted white and blue, the ancient town would be virtually indistinguishable from one of the modern villages on the island. PPPP. The ash is everywhere at Akrotiri, having gone into every nook and cranny of the site after the eruption. As a result, it has preserved everything as it was at the time of the explosion. Thus, large storage jars remain and can be excavated in place, though often fallen over from their original position. Other large artifacts, like wooden beds, also have been carefully excavated and retrieved, using the lost wax technique to reconstruct them when they have disintegrated and left empty spaces in the ash. Quite a bit of pottery has been recovered during the excavations, as well as objects made out of stone and other materials. Some of them, especially the pottery, are painted with marine scenes featuring dolphins and octopi. Others show nature scenes, including flowers, leaves, and long-stemmed grass, and birds in flight that look a lot like the swallows that can be seen on the island today. Finding Atlantis, 151. Wall paintings adorned the rooms in some of the houses. One of these, which features papyrus plants in a naturalistic scene that covers all four walls of the room, also has two of these little swallows interacting. In fact, the paintings at Akrotiri are among the best preserved that we have found from the Bronze Age Aegean, rivaling those found at Knossos. One is the so-called Nilotic fresco, which features a scene that might be depicting the Nile in Egypt. It has a leaping feline chasing a duck or goose. On both sides of the river, or stream, are what look like palm trees or perhaps papyrus plants. It was found in a house, the so-called West House, along with several other frescoes that have nautical or perhaps non-Theran scenes. It is possible that the house belonged to a ship captain or to someone who had traveled overseas. Another rather exotic-looking wall painting shows monkeys swinging from trees and generally hanging about, as monkeys like to do. The only thing is, these monkeys are blue, with white cheeks, which seems a little strange. There is a similar wall painting at Knossos on Crete, also showing blue monkeys, and there are two little blue monkey figurines with yellow cheeks that were found at Mycenae and Tiryns on the Greek mainland. What is even stranger is that monkeys are not indigenous to the Aegean region. It turns out that there is a species of monkey in Africa called a green guenon, whose fur can be a bluish-green color and who have yellow or whitish cheeks. They are found in areas like Nubia and were prized as pets by the pharaohs of New Kingdom Egypt, who occasionally sent them as gifts to rulers in other countries. So, strange as it may seem, it looks as if these paintings, and the figurines, are correct in their representations of the monkeys. They may represent a group that someone had seen in Egypt or that had been sent over as a gift from Egypt to the rulers of Santorini or Crete. One painting that seems a masterpiece shows two animals that look like ibexes, or wild goats, as typically found on Greek islands. These two in particular are each painted with a single bold stroke that goes from the tip of the tail all the way up to the neck and then the head of the animal, with the other details then added in as bold lines as well. This masterfully simple painting technique completely captures the two animals. A number of human figures also are depicted. One shows two young boys who seem to be boxing, which has been mentioned in passing in 152 Chapter 9. An earlier chapter, in connection with the priest-king fresco at Knossos. They are almost naked, wearing only loincloths, and have shaved heads with clumps of hair hanging down in curls. Where their hair is cut close to the scalp, it is shown as blue rather than black. There also is a painting of a naked young man holding two long strings of fish that he has just caught. This painting shows even more of his hair shaved off and fewer of the tendrils or ringlets. It has been suggested that the young boys had more and more hair shaved each year, perhaps in a ritual, so that by the time they were in their late teens, they had essentially a crew cut. Other pictures show young women engaged in a variety of activities, including a number who are picking flowers like crocuses and saffron. Some of these young women also have mostly shaved heads, just like the boys. If there was some sort of age-related ceremony related to hair, it apparently extended to the young women as well as the men. Many of the women are depicted wearing earrings and other jewelry and wearing elaborate dresses, so we can easily reconstruct how they adorned themselves back then. In the West House is another painting in addition to the Nilotic scene, which is known as the miniature fresco or the flotilla fresco. On one end of the scene, we can see warriors marching off to battle. They are dressed in a fashion like some of the warriors whom Homer describes in the Iliad. They wear boar-tusk helmets on their heads and carry what are called tower shields, which are long enough to cover a person from the neck down to the lower legs. Behind the warriors is a large building, with women standing on the roof apparently waving goodbye to the warriors. There also are what look like cows and other herd animals, and a herdsman in the distance above them, but below them is a scene with a few boats and men who are sideways or upside down, which is the way that artists in the Bronze Age depicted dead and drowning people. The scene is usually interpreted as a naval battle, though it also has been suggested that it is a scene of sacrifice. The fresco continues with a flotilla scene, showing as many as a dozen or more ships departing a port that may or may not be on Santorini. The men row their way across the sea, accompanied by cavorting dolphins, until they reach a second city, at which point they tie up the ships and presumably disembark. This part of the fresco has been the Finding Atlantis, 153. Topic of much discussion among archaeologists, with some focusing on the design and depiction of the ships and others focusing on where they might have begun their voyage and where they might have ended it. Suggestions include the possibility that this is a voyage to or from either Egypt or Anatolia, but there has not yet been any consensus on these interpretations. PPPP. Santorini also has been at the forefront of a huge debate among Bronze Age Aegean archaeologists ever since 1987, when a radical redating of the volcanic eruption was proposed. It used to be thought that the Santorini eruption took place in about 1450 BCE. Since a certain style of pottery, known as late Minoan IB pottery, was in vogue at the time of the eruption, it used to be thought this type of pottery should also be dated to about 1450 BCE. As a result of new analysis of radiocarbon dates from the site and nearby, however, it has been proposed that the eruption took place in or around 1628 BCE, rather than 1450 BCE, almost 2 full centuries earlier. Since the date of the eruption and use of LMIB pottery are still tied together, that means that any level at any site that contains such pottery actually dates to the 17th century BCE, not the 15th century BCE. This became known as the high chronology, because it proposes a much earlier date for these historical events. Sturt Manning, now of Cornell University, has been at the forefront of the discussions about the redating of the eruption since they first began. He has published numerous articles on the subject as well as a book called A Test of Time. One of the pieces of evidence that is central to his dating is a piece of wood from an olive tree that had been buried by ash during the eruption. The olive wood dates to about 1628 BCE. The redating assumes the accuracy of the new radiocarbon dates. But carbon dating is acknowledged to have some problems associated with it, including fluctuations in the ratio of carbon in the atmosphere and the possibility of contamination in the samples, and so not everyone has accepted this change in chronology. Some are willing to accept a bit of a change, but only pushing the date of the eruption back to 1550. 154 Chapter 9 BCE, rather than all the way back to 1628 BCE, thereby creating a middle chronology to go with high and low Santorini chronologies. As an aside, it should be noted that the redating of the eruption, regardless of which date one accepts, means that it cannot be linked in any way, shape, or form to the parting of the Red Sea or any of the 10 plagues associated with the exodus of the Israelites from Egypt. Few scholars had ever wished to connect these events anyway, though it is a favorite suggestion of pseudo-archaeologists, since the eruption occurred at least a century, and perhaps as much as 4 centuries, before the Exodus even possibly took place. For me, it seems likely that the high chronology is correct, but the debate is ongoing. I highlight this here to show that, even when we have lots of buildings, pottery, and other artifacts from a site, and we know relatively when it was flourishing, we cannot always be certain about the absolute, or chronological, date. We will discuss this issue, as well as radiocarbon dating itself, more in depth in a later chapter. PPPP. Santorini and Akrotiri are of great interest to archaeologists because they are central to any discussion about international trade and contact that may have been ongoing between Greece, Egypt, and the Near East more than 3,500 years ago. But they also are of interest to the general public because of the possible connections to the legend of Atlantis. As mentioned previously, I tend to believe that there is a kernel of truth lying at the bottom of many of the Greek myths and legends, for I think they probably based such tall tales on some aspect of their reality. Thus, I think that something did happen to spark the stories about the Trojan War. I also think that the eruption of Santorini in the 17th century BCE may be the real event that underlies the whole story of Atlantis. Here I am dangerously close to being in the realm of the pseudo-archaeologists, hunting for what may be fictional places, but I'll explain briefly why I believe the way I do. PPPP. Finding Atlantis, 155. The story of Atlantis comes to us courtesy of the Greek philosopher Plato. In two of his shorter works, called the Timaeus and the Critias respectively, which were written in the 4th century BCE, more than 1,000 years after Thera's eruption, Plato tells us about an incredible civilization and an island that sank, in a day and a night, beneath the waves, never to be seen again. It is in the Timaeus that he says specifically, there occurred violent earthquakes and floods, and in a single day and night of misfortune, the island of Atlantis disappeared in the depths of the sea. He never says where Atlantis was located, except that it was an island situated in front of the straits which are bayou called the Pillars of Heracles. The island was larger than Libya and Asia put together. An Egyptian priest, Plato says, told the initial story of Atlantis to a visiting Greek lawgiver named Solon sometime after 590 BCE. The priest told him that the events had taken place 9,000 years before their time, though, quite frankly, 900 years before Solon fits better, since that would put the events back at about 1500 BCE. Rather than back at 9600 BCE during the Neolithic Age when there weren't yet any complex cultures. The story was then handed down by Solon to his son and then his son's son, and so on, until it reached Plato somewhere around the year 400 BCE. Plato also gives a very detailed description of what Atlantis looked like, including that it was built of concentric and alternating rings of land and water, with specific measurements of various parts of the city and so on. But since his description of its location is pretty general, people have looked for it in all sorts of places, including the Bahamas, off the coast of Cyprus, and everywhere in between, as has been mentioned. None of the reported findings has yet panned out. Even when there is a similarity in physical layout, they are either natural formations or show no relationship to Greek culture, or both. Santorini comes closest, but even there the date is way off, as we saw. One could, and probably should, argue that Atlantis is a mythical place invented by Plato in order to describe what he thinks the perfect city and society might look like. There is, therefore, no reason to believe that we should be able to go out and find it. The eruption of Santorini, 156 Chapter 9. However, would have been both heard and felt as far away as Egypt. The Egyptians also would have seen the cloud resulting from the eruption, and eventually they would have seen pieces of pumice floating on the water and ending up on the northern shores. There has even been a suggestion by some Egyptologists and other scholars that a well-known Egyptian inscription called the Tempest Stele may be a contemporary account of what they saw and heard during and after the eruption. Moreover, if the Minoans and the Cycladic islanders, from places like Santorini, stopped coming to Egypt at least temporarily after the eruption, as seems quite likely to have happened, then to the Egyptians it would have seemed as if a great island empire had disappeared. From the point of view of those who were living in Akrotiri, and perhaps elsewhere on the island, their world had indeed come to an end in a single day and night of misfortune. Thus, the eruption of Santorini could be the basis for Plato's story of Atlantis. But even if it is not, the archaeological finds that have been made at the site of Akrotiri by Marinatos, Domas, and others have shed wonderful light on the Bronze Age Aegean during the 2nd millennium BCE, which, in my opinion, was among the most fascinating periods of human history. 10. Enchantment under the sea. In 1982, a 17-year-old sponge diver emerged from the Wine-Dark Sea off the coast of southwestern Turkey and told his captain that he had seen a metal biscuit with ears. When he drew a picture of it, the captain recognized it as an oxide copper ingot, which archaeologists from the Institute of Nautical Archaeology at Texas A&M University had asked him to keep an eye out for during their sponge diving season. He contacted the institute, and by the next summer the archaeologists confirmed that it had come from a shipwreck dating to the late Bronze Age. They had found what is now known as the Ulubaran shipwreck. The ship, which sank around 1300 BCE, is, without exaggeration, one of the most important archaeological discoveries of all time. Shipwrecks always represent a snapshot in time, from the Titanic on back, but it is unusual to find one from so early and so full of cargo. The Uluburun wreck was found stuffed with raw materials, including 158 Chapter 10. Copper, tin, ivory, and raw glass, as well as finished goods, such as pottery from Cyprus and Canaan, that sheds light on the international trade and relations that took place more than 3,000 years ago. It is extremely important as a microcosm of the interconnected world of that time. The fact that it was found in 140-170 feet of water, and that the archaeologists conducted more than 20,000 dives for a decade without a major accident reported, makes the tale even more unusual. PPPP. The story involves George Bass, the father of underwater archaeology, and Simul Pulak, who was first Bass's student and now is his colleague at the Institute for Nautical Archaeology at Texas A&M University. But it begins in 1959, when Bass was a graduate student at the University of Pennsylvania. He was trying to decide on a dissertation topic when Rodney Young, the curator of the Mediterranean section of the Penn Museum, called him into his office. A shipwreck had been found off the coast of Turkey and someone was needed to excavate it. Young thought that Bass would be a good choice. And he was. Bass went out and conducted the world's first underwater excavation on what is now known as the Cape Gelidonia shipwreck. This is why he is referred to as the father of underwater archaeology. The Gelidonia shipwreck lies reasonably close to the Uluburun shipwreck. Of course, Bass didn't know that at the time. It also dates from almost the same time period, because it sank in about 1200 BCE. On the Gelidonia wreck, Bass found artifacts that indicated it had been a small ship and was probably tramping around the Mediterranean, that is, going from port to port, buying and selling goods as it went. It does not appear to have belonged to a wealthy merchant or a king, but more likely to a private individual trying to earn a living. Among the objects that Bass retrieved were ingots of solid copper, the type that we call oxide ingots because they are in the shape of a cowhide or oxhide that might hang on a wall or be used on the floor as a rug. These copper ingots each weighed about 60 pounds and are the same as the metal biscuits with ears that the young sponge diver would find at Uluburun in 1982. Enchantment under the C-159. Bronze is frequently made by combining 90% copper and 10% tin. It would make sense, therefore, if there were also raw tin on board the Gelidonia wreck. And indeed there was. Unfortunately, most of it now looked more like toothpaste than raw tin, because of the corrosion caused by saltwater, and some scholars doubted the identification. Judging from the artifacts that he excavated, Bass also said that the wreck was a Canaanite ship possibly on its way to the Aegean. This went very much against the scholarly thinking of the day, especially since it was generally thought that only the Minoans on Crete might have been sailing the seas. After all, Thucydides talks about the Minoan thalassocracy or rule of the sea. When Bass published his book on the shipwreck in 1967, it was met with derision and disdain in some scholarly quarters. As it turned out, Bass was not only correct on all counts, but he was far ahead of his time in recognizing that others besides the Minoans had been sailing the seas. PPPP. Bass was determined to find another wreck at some point that would confirm his conclusions about the Gelidonia shipwreck. In the meantime, he founded the American Institute of Nautical Archaeology in 1972 while still at the University of Pennsylvania and then moved with it to Texas A&M University in 1976, where it, and he, has remained ever since, though they long ago dropped the American from their name. To reflect the international nature of their work. In 1980, the Institute purchased a boat and they began doing underwater surveys, searching for other shipwrecks. Underwater surveys can be long and time-consuming, especially back then in the 1980s, when surveys were done as if on land, by following long transects and recording what was seen. At some point, they had the bright idea that instead of doing the surveying themselves, they could simply visit the villages in which the Turkish sponge divers lived and describe to them what they were looking for. That way, they could enlist the help of the professionals who were diving to the bottom of the sea every day, looking for sponges to sell. 160 Chapter 10. And, sure enough, soon thereafter, in 1982, the young sponge diver spotted the metal biscuit with ears. Bass was on his way toward excavating another wreck that would confirm his conclusions about the Geladonia shipwreck. What he didn't realize at the time was that the Uluburun shipwreck was far richer and far more important than what he had found previously. The importance of his discovery can be measured by the fact that just a few years later, in 1986, and long before the completion of the excavations, Bass received the Gold Medal Award for Distinguished Archaeological Achievement from the Archaeological Institute of America, the highest honor that his colleagues could bestow. Uluburun diver. Enchantment under the C-161. The excavation of the Uluburun shipwreck began in earnest during summer 1984, under Bass's direction. The next year, in 1985, he turned over direction of the project to Simul Pulak. From then until 1994, excavations were conducted virtually every summer, with a team of professional archaeologists and eager graduate students. They dove on the wreck every day, with each of them diving twice a day, but spending only about 20 minutes on the bottom each time. Decompression was a major physical danger to the divers, and decompressing from that depth took a long time. To pass the time, they took to reading novels tied to a rope, once they were close enough to the surface that there was enough light to read by. They collectively worked for more than 6,600 hours while excavating the ship during those 10 years, diving more than 22,000 times on the wreck. It turned out that the top part of the wreck was 140 feet below sea level, but the scatter of remains continued on down to a depth of 170 feet. Even then, they found that the front part of the 50-foot-long ship had broken off and plunged off a cliff or ledge. It has never been recovered. Bass said that, at that depth, it felt like they had had 2 martinis before even beginning to work, and so they had to plan out every dive meticulously in advance. They also dove in pairs, using the buddy system, and had an ex-Navy SEAL overseeing their safety, which explains the lack of reported accidents even over the course of a decade. Bass once described, in a Nova video, what it was like to be part of the team. As soon as you get to the seabed, he said, you remove the flippers from your feet, so that you don't accidentally excavate anything when swimming or walking close to the sand on the bottom. You grab a vacuum tube coming down from the surface in order to remove a lot of the loose sand, but then, when you move to delicate excavation, you move your hand in a continuous scooping motion in order to remove the sand carefully. Because simply waving your hand back and forth does nothing but stir up the sand and cloud your vision. You are helping to map each part of the wreck, and each object found within it, meticulously, because your final plans are to be drawn within millimeter accuracy, as accurately as any plan done at an archaeological site on land. It's hard enough to do that well on land. Imagine doing it at 140 feet below the surface after having had a 2-martini lunch. 162 Chapter 10. The team ultimately found so many objects that the final report was still being created at the time that I was writing this book, and will take up several volumes when it is finally published. In the meantime, either Bass or Pulak has published a preliminary report after the end of each season. They also have presented papers at many conferences, which have since been published. In order to dive on the wreck, the team lived for several months each summer in wooden buildings that they constructed on the cliff face of the promontory into which the Uluburun ship had probably slammed before it sank more than 3,000 years ago. There also was some living space on their dive boat, the Virazon, which was permanently moved directly above the shipwreck. With one dormitory for the men and another for the women, plus a building for the kitchen and eating area, another for the conservation and storage of the artifacts, and still one more, hanging out over the water, used as a bathroom, the team truly lived off the grid. A several-hour boat ride away from the nearest town or city. PPPP. We know when the boat sank, because of 4 separate pieces of evidence. First, there is a gold scarab containing the name of Queen Nefertiti that was found on board. She ruled with Pharaoh Akhenaten sometime around 1350 BCE, and so the ship cannot have sunk before that time. Second, some of the wood from the hull of the ship was recovered and dated to about 1320 BCE, using dendrochronology dating, in which tree rings are counted to provide a date for the cutting of the wood used. Third, the Mycenaean and Minoan pottery on board is of a style called Late Helladic IIA2, which archaeologists date to the last part of the 14th century BCE using comparisons from other Greek sites. And fourth, they were able to use carbon-14 to date some of the brushwood that was on board. These all indicate that the ship sank about 1300 BCE, which is about 30 years after the time of King Tut's burial in Egypt and perhaps a few decades before the time of the Trojan War. We also now know what the ship was carrying. First of all, underneath the rest of the cargo, and spaced out along the length of the hull. Enchantment under the C-163 were approximately 14 large stone anchors. These were used as ballast for most of the journey, but as each one was needed, it was put into use. That way, if one of the anchors got stuck on a rock or a reef, the sailors could simply cut the rope and then retrieve another one from down in the cargo hull. Such stone anchors have been found at several sites on land, like Kition or in Komi on Cyprus and Ugarit in coastal Syria, but none had never before been found still in place within a sunken ship from the Bronze Age. The main cargo was oxide ingots, made of 99% pure raw copper from Cyprus. There were more than 350 of these ingots on board the ship, stacked row upon row in the hold. We have one letter that was written from the king of Cyprus to the king of Egypt from about 1350 BCE, in which he apologizes for sending only 200 copper ingots. This ship shows that as many as 350 could be shipped at once during this time period. Such ingots may have been used as currency, bullion for international trade. All told, there is more than 10 tons of copper on board this one ship. Some of the ingots were so corroded that the archaeologists had to essentially invent a new type of glue, which they injected into the remains of the ingot and then allowed to harden for the entire year between excavation seasons. Then they carefully picked up each one and floated it to the surface before taking them all back to the museum at Bodrum. There they were conserved and cleaned of the corrosion that had accumulated over the centuries. As for the tin that Base had found on the Geladonia shipwreck, which looked like toothpaste and was doubted by many scholars, the Ulubaran shipwreck vindicated him here as well, for it contained more than a ton of tin, in recognizable forms this time, some as fragments of oxide ingots. Others as a smaller type of ingot called a bun ingot, yet others as plates and other vessels made of tin. The tin had traveled a long way already, for its origin was likely the Badakhshan region of Afghanistan, but its voyage wasn't supposed to be over until it had reached the Aegean, most likely, although the sinking of the ship foiled that plan. 10 tons of copper and 1 ton of tin will make 11 tons of bronze. Base once estimated that this would have been enough to outfit an army of 300 soldiers with swords, shields, helmets. 164 Chapter 10. Greaves, and other necessary accoutrements. Not only did someone lose a fortune when the ship went down, but someone also might have lost a war. Other raw materials were on board as well, including approximately 1 ton of terebinth resin, which was used as incense and for making perfume, among other things. It comes from the pistachio tree and has never been found in such quantities in one place before. The resin was being carried in some of the so-called Canaanite storage jars, of which there were about 140 on board. These are just what they sound like, transportation and storage jars made in Canaan that could hold any number of things. On the Ulubaran ship, they were found to contain not only the resin, but also glass beads, thousands of them in some cases, as well as food such as figs and dates. One jar held a small folding wooden tablet, with ivory hinges. It probably floated into the jar by accident after the ship sank. Inside the tablet, the two sides, which are recessed, would have originally held wax, colored yellow by terebinth resin. On this wax would have been written some sort of message, for this is what we call a diptych or a wooden writing tablet. Homer talks about such a tablet in Book 6 of the Iliad, when he mentions a tablet with baneful signs. Unfortunately, the wax in the Ulubaran tablet is long gone. A second tablet also was found in the excavations, but the wax was gone there too. Thus, we don't know what was originally written in either one. Was it the ship's itinerary? Was it the manifest of the cargo? Was it a message from one king to another? We'll never know. Among the raw goods being transported on the ship, the archaeologists recovered approximately 175 bun ingots of raw glass. Most were dark cobalt blue, but others were light blue, and some were in amber color. The chemical analyses of these ingots of raw glass matched those from objects of glass found in both Egypt and Greece during this time period, indicating that everyone was getting their raw glass from the same source, possibly in northern Syria or Egypt. A cache of raw ivory on board the ship included both elephant tusks and hippopotamus canines and incisors. After these were discovered in the wreck, other scholars went back and re-examined ivory objects dating to the Late Bronze Age in various museums around the world. They enchantment under the C-165 had previously assumed that most were made from elephant ivory, but to their surprise it seems that most are from hippopotamus ivory. There also was a very small jawbone from what seems to have been a Syrian house mouse, a stowaway who climbed on board the ship at some point, perhaps during a stop at the coastal port of Ugarit. And there was ebony wood as well, which comes from Nubia, south of Egypt in northeast Africa. The cargo also contained many finished goods, some of them secured in a manner that was rather unexpected. The archaeologists were excavating large jars, similar to those that can be seen on the deck of Bronze Age ships, as painted in scenes on the walls of high-ranking Egyptian nobles' tombs. It had always been assumed that these large jars were used to hold fresh water for the crew members to drink. But when the archaeologists began to lift one up and put it into a net, so that it could be floated to the surface, it tilted forward and pottery began to come out, fresh, brand new, and used pottery. There were plates and dishes and bowls, and big jugs and little juglets, and oil lamps, all from Cyprus and Canaan. It seems that these large jars were not used to hold drinking water but were what we would call china barrels, used to pack and protect new pottery in transit. There also is one very strange-looking stone item, which has been identified as a mace from the Balkans, as well as several swords. One seems to be Canaanite, one is of Aegean type, and one seems to be Italian. They were probably the personal possessions of the crew members or the captain, but we cannot be certain. The arrowheads and spearheads that were found, as well as various bronze tools, could all be either personal possessions or parts of the cargo. There are fishhooks and lead weights too, which were undoubtedly used by the crew members to help them catch fresh fish during the voyage. The foodstuffs that have been identified from the Ulubaran wreck were all products of the eastern Mediterranean, including olives, almonds, figs, and pomegranates, in addition to fish. These are pretty much the same things that a ship's crew would be eating today in that same area. But there are also a few fancy drinking cups, made of faience in zoomorphic shapes, like a ram's head. They are usually identified as items used by royalty, which 166 Chapter 10 may support the idea that the ship was carrying a royal gift from one king to another. We know from textual evidence that rulers did exchange lavish gifts during this period, and so it is not out of the question that we are looking at one here, perhaps being sent from Egypt or Canaan to a Mycenaean king, maybe Agamemnon's ancestor at Mycenae. We shall probably never know for sure. Among the items that could be construed as worthy of a king is a single gold cup. Although pretty, it is not of much use in determining anything about the ship, its origins, or its date, because it is actually rather generic. There is an iconic photograph, now found in most archaeology textbooks, that was taken before the cup was removed from the seabed. In the picture are the gold cup, a Canaanite jar, a flask made from tin, and a rather plain-looking Mycenaean kylix. When I ask my students what the most important object in the picture is, they invariably point to the gold cup, but this would be wrong. I quote to them from the third Indiana Jones movie, telling them that they have chosen poorly. Although the Canaanite jar is important for what it contained, and the flask is important because it is one of the few that we have that is made from tin, it is the plain-looking Mycenaean pottery vessel that is the most important piece in the picture. Because its distinctive shape helped us to date the wreck. Base, Pulak, and their team members also found many pieces of jewelry, ranging from silver bracelets to gold pendants. One of the pendants is a marvelous piece of work, with granulated dots of gold creating a falcon or some other bird clutching a snake in its claws. Another depicts a woman holding a gazelle in each hand. Still another is a type that we can see worn by Canaanite men in Egyptian tomb paintings. There also are cylinder seals from Mesopotamia, including one made from rock crystal with a gold cap on either end, which would have been worn tied around one's wrist or neck, and a small piece of black stone from Egypt that is inscribed Ta, Lord of Truth. Of the scarabs and other small items engraved with Egyptian hieroglyphics, the solid gold scarab of Queen Nefertiti, inscribed with her name in hieroglyphics, Neferneferuaten, is the most important but also one of the smallest. This is a version of her name that she used only during the first 5 years or so of her reign, when her husband, the heretic pharaoh Akhenaten, was condemning everything under the sun. Enchantment under the C-167. Except for Aten, who was the god represented by the disk of the sun. This is a rare find in one, as we have noted, that helps us date the ship, for it cannot have sunk before the scarab was made, that is prior to about 1350 BCE. The one thing that has not been recovered from the shipwreck are bodies, or any partial skeletons at all. It may be that the survivors swam to shore or that their bodies fell victim to the fishes and other sea life while lying underwater for 3,200 years. PPPP. When the wreck was first found, the excavators thought that the Ulubaran ship had most likely been going from port to port around the eastern Mediterranean and Aegean regions in a counterclockwise direction, perhaps tramping like the Geladonia ship would do a century later. But with a cargo that was much richer. Since then, other suggestions have been made, including the possibility that it was a cargo meant as a royal gift from one king to another, which we know occurred at the time, and that perhaps it was being sent from Egypt to Greece or from Canaan to Greece or even from Cyprus to Greece. In every case, though, it is agreed that it was heading to Greece because, although there are objects on board that come from at least 7 different cultures and that are clearly meant as cargo, the only objects from Greece are a number of Minoan and Mycenaean ceramic vessels that are used rather than new, and 2 personal seals that might have been worn by someone from the Aegean. The objects found on board were probably designed to appeal to a Greek audience. On its return trip, or perhaps on the continuation of its trip counterclockwise around the region, the ship probably would have carried a full cargo of typical Mycenaean and Minoan goods, including ceramic vessels full of wine, olive oil, and perfume destined for Egypt, Canaan, and Cyprus. Of course, it never made that return voyage because it sank at Ulubaran, despite the presence of what might have been a protective deity on board the ship, a small figurine, made of bronze but covered with gold foil on its head and shoulders, hands, and feet. It was found completely corroded, but it cleaned up nicely, as we say in the archaeological world. The style of the figurine is typical of votive. 168 Chapter 10. Objects, that is, figures created to express both religious devotion and the desire for divine protection. If it is the protective deity for the ship, it didn't do its job very well. Their bad luck, though, was our good luck, because we are now able to study this ship and its cargo in its entirety and get a glimpse of what life was like during the international world of the Late Bronze Age more than 3,000 years ago. PA RT 4. Uncovering the Classics. 1-1. From discuss throwing to democracy. At the 2016 Olympics in Rio de Janeiro, there were competitions in 42 sporting events, ranging from aquatics and archery to weightlifting and wrestling. But one contest from the ancient Olympics wasn't held, the race in which the runners participated while wearing armor, including a helmet on their head, greaves on their shins, and a shield on their left arm. Similarly, there weren't any chariot races in Rio, nor was there the pankration, a no-holds-barred martial art event akin to today's kickboxing or perhaps a combination of karate and judo, in which everything was allowed, except for biting, eye gouging, and scratching. The first Olympic Games took place nearly 3,000 years ago, in 776 BCE. They were then held every 4th year, for more than 1,000 years. Athletes came from all over the Greek world to 172 Chapter 11. Compete, which is why we refer to the Games as Panhellenic. There were 293 Olympiads in all, before the Roman Emperor Theodosius declared an end to all pagan festivals in the early 390s CE. The search for Olympia, the site where the Olympic Games had been held, proved as big a beacon to early explorers and archaeologists as the sites mentioned by Homer. Just as Schliemann searched for Troy, Mycenae, Tiryns, and Ithaca, so too did others search for sites famous in Greek history for other reasons. Close behind the search for Olympia and its games was the hunt for Delphi and its oracle, as well as Athens for its Acropolis and Agora, birthplace of democracy. The foreign schools of archaeology split up these sites. The Germans were excavating at Olympia by 1875, the French at Delphi by 1892, the Americans in the Agora of Athens by 1931, but Greek archaeologists also were participants in the exploration of their own heritage. Just as Stamatakis dug at Mycenae after Schliemann's initial excavations. It is on these sites that we will focus in this chapter. PPPP. The site of Olympia was not easy for archaeologists to find. After the last Olympic Games in 393 CE, the sanctuary slowly fell into disuse and was eventually abandoned. The buildings were tossed around and knocked to the ground by earthquakes in the 6th century CE, leaving the column from the magnificent temples fallen like parallel toothpicks. Adding insult to injury, the nearby rivers both overflowed their banks. One, the Cladios River, had done so already in the 4th century CE while the games were still active, but the final ignominy came when the Alpheos River also flooded the area during the Middle Ages, leaving the site covered with a layer of silt and mud more than 4 meters deep. It was in 1766 that the English explorer Richard Chandler first successfully located the site. By asking the locals about their discoveries of ancient ruins and using the guidebook written in the 2nd century CE by Pausanias, just as Schliemann would do a century later at Mycenae, Chandler was able to identify the site of the sanctuary, including remains left from the Temple of Zeus, the Greek god to whom the entire sanctuary was dedicated. From DISCUS Throwing to Democracy 173. When we last visited during March 2015, with a group of George Washington University students, the remains were a pleasure to behold. Small white daisies and wild red poppies mingled with ancient lichen-covered gray stones in a fresh carpet of green grass. Some of the students gave their reports about the individual monuments while wearing tiaras of woven daisy chains on their heads. Springtime in the northwestern Peloponnese region of Greece is beautiful, but the ancient Greeks came for more than just beauty. They came to honor Zeus and to win athletic competitions. The famous games were part of the festivities that were held to honor Zeus, as much religious as they were athletic, and the temple that Chandler had identified was the most famous building at the site. It also was the largest temple discovered in Greece at the time, measuring 64 meters by 28 meters. The pedamental sculptures and the metopes decorating the temple depicted a mythical chariot race, a battle involving centaurs, and the 12 labors of Heracles. It had taken 10 years to build it in the mid-5th century. Most important, it once held the 40-foot-tall gold and ivory statue of Zeus made by the famous Greek sculptor Phidias, which was one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Alas, by the time that Chandler found the building, the statue was long gone, having been taken away to Constantinople in what is now Turkey during the 4th century CE, where it was later destroyed when the building in which it was housed caught fire. Pausanias reported that there were numerous other statues here as well, but of normal size, some of marble and some of bronze, made by some of the most famous Greek sculptors, including Praxiteles and Lysippus. It was for these famous pieces of ancient art, in part, that the first archaeologists at Olympia came, meaning that the excavations here began for much the same reason as those at Herculaneum in Italy a century earlier. PPPP. The French conducted excavations at Olympia in 1829 and recovered fragments of carved metopes from the Temple of Zeus. Alternating. 174 Chapter 11. With triglyphs, such metopes were architectural elements that frequently made up part of the decoration of Greek temples between the tops of the columns and the roof. These particular ones, depicting the labors of Heracles, are now in the Louvre in Paris. It was the Germans, however, who contracted with the Greek government for exclusive rights to excavate the site from 1875 to 1881. Known as the Olympia Convention, the contract established a precedent for all subsequent foreign excavations in Greece. It stated that all the finds discovered during the excavation would remain in Greece, unless the government decided to present duplicates or facsimiles to the excavators, or their government, in thanks for their work. The Germans, in return, were required to publish the results of the excavation for the scholarly community, which they did quite promptly, including inscriptions, sculptures, and buildings. Their investigations have been hailed by Helmut Kyrielius, a later director, as the first major excavation at a classical site to have specific scientific objectives. It was their detailed reports, in part, that prompted Baron Pierre de Coubertin, a Frenchman, to initiate the modern Olympic Games, first held in Athens in 1896. Wilhelm Dorpfeld was associated with these early German excavations at Olympia, serving as an architect and learning the skills of an archaeologist. It was Dorpfeld who gave Heinrich Schliemann a tour of the site in 1881, when he came to see what they had found. Schliemann was so impressed by Dorpfeld that he invited him to come work at Troy, which Dorpfeld did a year later. This was a fortuitous pairing and a great partnership, for the two worked together not only at Troy but then at Tiryns. Dorpfeld subsequently directed excavations at Troy after Schliemann's death, as we have already described in an earlier chapter. Arthur Evans once remarked that Dorpfeld, a meticulous, science-oriented scholar, was Schliemann's greatest discovery. A new team of German archaeologists resumed excavations at Olympia in 1937, capitalizing on the interest that had been generated by the Berlin Olympics the previous year. This second period of excavation lasted for nearly 3 decades, though that included a 10-year break. During and immediately after World War II, they too made use of Pausanias's detailed description of the site, without which most of the buildings would probably have remained unidentified. Other. From DISCUS Throwing to Democracy 175. Investigations continued thereafter, but it was really only in 1985, under the direction of Kyrielius, that the most recent campaign was begun at the site. More than a century of excavation has exposed enough that it is now possible to walk through the site and see the buildings in the central sanctuary area, including the great altar to Zeus, the temple to Hera, and buildings such as the Prytaneon and Bouleuterion, where the administrators and council members in charge of the sanctuary and festival met. The gymnasium and the paletra, where the athletes practiced and trained for a month before the games, are to one side of the sanctuary area, along with the swimming pool. The hippodrome, where the chariot races were held, and the stadium where the foot races were run are on the other side. It was the excavation of the 600-foot-long stadium, originally built about 350 BCE, which was the most expensive and time-consuming part of the project, since it involved the removal of hundreds of tons of earth. All the efforts by the archaeologists paid off, for they recovered a tremendous amount of information from inscriptions, statues, and buildings, as well as pottery and other artifacts. In 1989, Olympia was named a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Nearly 500,000 tourists now visit it each year. During the excavation in the 1950s of the dirt embankments on the sides of the stadium, where upward of 40,000 spectators would have watched the athletic races, the archaeologists unexpectedly came upon piece after piece of bronze armor and weapons, including 22 bronze helmets, as well as shields, greaves, and swords. Originally they were fastened to wooden poles or stakes driven into the earth of the embankments, in rows above the spectators. Visually it would have looked like flags flying at the top of the Los Angeles Coliseum or any high school football stadium today, but they were dedications to Zeus made by victorious warriors. The armor and weapons were placed here so that the citizens from various Greek city-states could admire the warriors' individual strength and success or collectively give thanks for group endeavors like the Persian War. Found among the trophies was a bronze helmet dedicated by Miltiades, the general who led the Greeks to victory over the Persians at the Battle of Marathon in 490 BCE. It is a plain helmet, of the common type that archaeologists call Corinthian. Inscribed along the bottom. 176 Chapter 11. Edge of the cheek piece are the words Miltiades presented this to Zeus. There also is a Persian helmet, captured in the same engagement and dedicated afterward, according to the inscription that is engraved upon it, to Zeus from the Athenians, who took it from the Medes. Other dedications, usually more valuable objects made of gold and silver, were housed in small buildings known as treasuries. They were each constructed to look like a miniature temple and were built by the various Greek city-states and colonies to hold the objects sent by their citizens. Another plain artifact with an inscription from Olympia is equally famous today, but it was not a dedication. Instead, it is a broken ceramic cup or wine jug, inscribed on the bottom with the words "I belong to Phidias." It is thought to have been the personal drinking cup of the sculptor himself. The Germans found it in 1958, in a building just outside the sanctuary area that must have been the workshop in which Phidias created the colossal statue of Zeus. The building had later been converted into a Byzantine church, but its proportions exactly matched the dimensions of the room and the temple where the statue stood for centuries. 2 deposits of waste material excavated by the archaeologists nearby include bits of ivory, metal, and glass, terracotta molds, and tools, among which was a goldsmith's hammer. The games themselves grew more elaborate over the years, with new events added every so often. When the games first began in 776 BCE, they consisted of a simple foot race. 2 longer foot races were added later that same century. Wrestling and boxing followed, as did the pentathlon, which involved competing in 5 sports: discus, javelin, jumping, running, and wrestling. Chariot races, the race in full armor, and the pancration also were added. Not all these events were conducted as they are today. For instance, the long jumpers competed while holding weights in their hands, which they threw behind themselves while in mid-air in order to propel themselves farther. The German archaeologists unearthed some of these weights more than 2,000 years after the victors dedicated them at the site. By about 100 BCE, there were a full 5 days of athletics and religious festivities. The winners, of which there was only one in each competition, were each awarded a crown of. From DISCUS Throwing to Democracy 177. Laurel leaves on the last day of the games. They frequently also received much more elaborate gifts upon returning to their home city, including food and lodging for life for Athenian victors. The popularity of the games continued even after the Romans conquered Greece in the 2nd century BCE, until Theodosius brought them to an end more than 500 years later. The Roman Emperor Nero was especially enamored of them and even participated in the Olympics of 67 CE. While in the chariot race, he fell off before reaching the finish line but was declared the winner anyway. He also ordered that there be a public musical performance, in which he would participate, and had the town gates shut so that nobody could leave. The Roman biographer Suetonius tells us, with perhaps a bit of exaggeration, that some women faked giving birth while Nero was on stage, and other spectators jumped from the top of the sanctuary walls or pretended to be dead so that they would be carried out for their funeral, in order to get away. Because other Panhellenic athletic competitions were held in the intervening years, the Olympic Games were held only every 4th year. In between, one per year, the Isthmian Games were held in Corinth and the Nemean Games at Nemea, and the Pythian Games were held at Delphi. At each of these sites, just as at Olympia, temples, treasuries, and athletic facilities were constructed, as were other monuments to the patron deity. At Delphi, that was the god Apollo. It was the oracle at Delphi, located in the temple to Apollo, which brought importance, fame, and wealth to the site in antiquity. Located in central Greece among the foothills of Mount Parnassus, the oracle was personified by a sacred priestess who reportedly sat on a tripod in an inner room above a crack in the ground. Vapors oozed from this fissure, sending her into a trance and allowing the god to speak through her, giving often enigmatic answers to questions posed by the petitioners. During the 8th and 7th centuries BCE, the oracle was frequently consulted by Greek city-states wishing to send out colonists to areas from the Black Sea to southern Italy and beyond, including Cyrene. 178 Chapter 11. In North Africa and Marseilles in southern France. How the oracle knew what to recommend is a very good question, but it seems that most of the colonies were successful, with some eventually surpassing the mother city in prosperity and prestige. The most famous question, according to the Greek historian Herodotus, was reportedly asked by King Croesus of Lydia, who desired to know whether he should go to war against the Persians, led by Cyrus the Great, in the mid-6th century BCE. The oracle replied that if he led an army against the Persians, he would destroy a great empire. Croesus took this to be in his favor, went to war, and lost. It was his own empire that was destroyed, thus fulfilling the prophecy. None of this has left any trace, however, as the French excavators of the site have found. No tripod, no priestess, not even a crack in the ground, although 2 earthquake fault lines may meet somewhere near here. The French archaeologists were granted permission to excavate Delphi by virtue of contracts signed with the Greek government in March and May 1891. First, however, they had to move the entire modern village, which was built directly on top of the ancient sanctuary. At a cost of $150,000 at the time, they moved all 300 owners into new houses in the fresh village that was created and then commenced digging. Even then they still faced resistance from some of the villagers, who were not happy with the money that they had been paid for their previous houses. Eventually things settled down and the French archaeologists were able to proceed with the excavation. Their results were so remarkable that Delphi, regarded by the ancient Greeks as the navel of the world, is today one of the most beautiful and frequently visited tourist destinations in the country. It was named a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1987. These French archaeologists were not the first to dig at the site, for attempts had been undertaken from time to time during the previous decades, beginning in the 1820s. Theirs, however, was an officially sanctioned and elaborate expedition, complete with an 1,800-meter-long railroad track that was set in place to take away the huge volumes of dirt that they were removing. The dig lasted for a bit more than 10 years, from October 1892 until May 1903, and was from DISCUS Throwing to Democracy 179. Dubbed the Great Excavation. It was indeed great, both in terms of the discoveries that were made and the number of workers that were employed, up to 220 at one point in 1893. Since then, nothing on a similar scale has been attempted in terms of excavation at the site, although additional short-term investigations have taken place at various times in the 1920s, 1930s, 1970s, and 1980s, 1990s. Thus, there is little to discuss about modern archaeological techniques or advances that have been used at the site. Much has, however, been done in terms of the conservation and preservation of what was found in that decade of excavation more than a century ago, and the publication of what was found has been nothing short of remarkable, with more than 60 volumes published to date about the various buildings, inscriptions, and other finds. The first season, in 1892, was very brief because they had been delayed by last-minute negotiations with the villagers, and so the first major finds began coming in 1893, with more in 1894 and the years immediately following. It must have been tremendously exciting to be Temple of Apollo, Delphi. 180 Chapter 11. On the French archaeological team during those heady days. Photography was still new at the time, but the archaeologists put it to good use. Some 2,000 glass photographic plates still exist at the French School of Athens, which record some of the spectacular finds at the moment of their discovery. Several statues, in particular, were nothing short of sensational. The matching set of young men known as Cleobes and Biton of Argos, carved in marble in the archaic style of the late 7th century BC, came up one at a time, in 1893 and 1894. The story of these two brothers is known from Herodotus's histories, where he describes how these dutiful sons yoked themselves to their mother's wagon and pulled it for 5 miles so that she could attend a religious festival. In their honor, Herodotus says, the Argives made and dedicated at Delphi statues of them as being the best of men. Now the proud archaeologists and their workers had recovered these statues. The black and white photographs show them clustered around the heads and torsos as the statues emerged from the dirt. Another statue, perhaps the most famous to be found at the site, is known simply as the charioteer. Made of bronze, the lower part was uncovered first by the French archaeologists, along with its inscribed stone base, toward the end of April 1896. The upper part, with the head and face still intact, complete with inlaid glass eyes, was found a few days later, in early May. Again, photographs record the moments of discovery. The inscription records the fact that Hieron of Syracuse was victorious in the Pythian Games in 478 BCE. He was the brother of the tyrant Gelon and owned the winning chariot, for it was the owner, not the driver, of the chariot who was declared the winner of such races. His other brother Polyzelos apparently rededicated the statue later so that he could claim the victory for himself. Buildings and other structures were uncovered as well. Parts of the treasuries of the Athenians, the Siphnians, the Sicyon, and the Nidians, among others, came to light, complete with fragments of their elaborate friezes and other decorations scattered in the dirt around them. In these small but beautiful buildings, the named city-states stored the precious gold and silver dedications made by their citizens. From DISCUS Throwing to Democracy 181. Though these had long since been stolen by the Roman conquerors Sulla and Nero reportedly took as many as 500 statues from the sanctuary as well. The remains of the temple to Apollo also made their appearance. So too did the stadium for the races in the Pythian Games, held once every 4 years, like the Olympic Games, as well as the site's gymnasium. Inscriptions also were found, so many that sometimes dozens appeared in a single day. Among the most famous were fragments of 2 Delphic hymns to Apollo from the 2nd century BCE. They were found in 1893, inscribed on stones discovered within the treasury of the Athenians. In between the lines of texts are symbols representing vocal and instrumental notations, so that it was possible to attempt to perform the hymns as originally intended, which was promptly done in mid-March 1894 for the Greek king and queen. Additional performances were held in St. Petersburg and Johannesburg, but it was the one in Paris that same year, at a conference organized by Pierre de Coubertin, that persuaded others to join his movement for the revival of the Olympic Games. The Sacred Way also was uncovered, winding its way up the mountain from the sanctuary entrance to the stadium like a snake, as befitting the original name for the area, Pytho, before it was renamed Delphi. Today we can all climb the same serpentine path taken by pilgrims and tourists, as described by Pausanias. Taking in the views of the sacred olive groves in the valley and the view of the Peloponnese across the gulf never fails to fill me with a sense of awe and wonder, the two key ingredients for a religious experience in ancient times, and perhaps modern times as well. Coming up from the terrace of the much smaller Athena sanctuary below, where the gymnasium also is located, we cross the modern road and start out in a paved area just inside the main entrance to the site. We immediately begin walking past statues and other dedications made by individuals as well as city-states, standing on both sides of the Sacred Way. Many of these commemorate military victories, including a dedication by the Athenians marking the victory over the Persians at Marathon in 490 BC and an entire building commissioned by the Spartans in memory of their victory over the Athenians at Aegospotami in 405 BC as the final battle of the Peloponnesian War. 182 Chapter 11. As we proceed up the path and sweep around the first bend to the right, we pass by the treasuries erected by the various Greek city-states. All these are now long gone, as mentioned, along with the riches that they once contained. Only their foundations were left, uncovered by the French archaeologists in 1893, 1894, along with pieces of their once richly painted metopes and friezes, depicting battles between gods and giants, the exploits of Theseus, and a variety of other scenes. As we continue up the hill, we have the sheer wall of the foundations of the Temple of Apollo on our left, for we are still far below the ground level of the temple. Up against this is the portico of the Athenians. Now bare of offerings, the portico has only an inscription, which reads the Athenians dedicated the portico and the arms and the figureheads which they took from their enemies. Good detective work by a French scholar in 1948 proved that the inscription refers to cables belonging to a bridge that the Persian king Xerxes had constructed when crossing the Hellespont between Anatolia and Greece during his invasion in 480 BCE. The Athenians retrieved the cables as souvenirs after they defeated Xerxes at Plataea and Salamis that year and dedicated them here in this portico at Delphi. As we round the next bend, turning to our left, we also come around the corner of the temple and are nearing its front entrance. We can see in the distance where the tripod of Plataea, sometimes called the serpent column, once stood, opposite the altar of Apollo and the entrance to the temple. This golden tripod, set on a base of 3 intertwined bronze snakes, commemorated the Greek victory over the Persians at the Battle of Plataea in 479 BCE. The tripod itself was stolen or destroyed long ago. The bronze base made of the 3 snakes, on which was inscribed the names of the 31 Greek city-states whose men fought in the battle, also was removed. But in its case we know who took it and where it went. It was the Roman Emperor Constantine the Great who moved them in the 4th century CE to his new capital city of Constantinople, now better known as modern Istanbul. They are still there today and can be seen in the middle of the Hippodrome in Sultanahmet Square, although their heads are in the nearby Istanbul Archaeology Museum. From DISCUS Throwing to Democracy 183. Venturing off the Sacred Way and into the precinct of the Temple of Apollo, we see the reconstructed ruins, with some of the original 6 pillars standing upright in front. 6 more would have been at the back. Another 15 would have been on each side, 2 more than usual for this type of temple, because it had to be lengthened in order to accommodate extra space for the oracle, the most famous in all of Greece. Even the present temple itself is reported by Pausanias to be the 5th iteration, though his account might not be entirely believable since he claims that the first 3 were built from laurel branches, beeswax, and bronze, respectively, before the 4th one was finally built of stone. More dependable, perhaps, are the findings by the archaeologists that there were at least 2 previous temples in this location. The first one burned down in 548 BCE, and an earthquake in 373 BCE destroyed the second one. The one visible now was built later in the 4th century. The French archaeologists found an inscription listing the benefactors who helped pay for its reconstruction and were also able to ascertain that it took almost 40 years to rebuild it, in part because of the attacks on Greece by Philip II of Macedon, father of Alexander the Great, during that period. Retracing our steps and leaving the temple, we return to the sacred way and turn left again, heading around the far side of the temple. Off to our right as we turn this corner are additional statues and other dedications, with a large colonnaded building known as a stoa in the distance behind them. Attilos I, a Hellenistic monarch who ruled Pergamon during the 3rd century BCE, built and dedicated this stoa. His younger son, and eventual successor, Attilos II, built a similar stoa in Athens in the mid-2nd century BCE. As we reach the far end of the temple, we see to our right the Great Theatre. We see also, above it all, the stadium, excavated by the French in 1896 and in which the races were run during the Pythian Games. Overall, the same sorts of competitions and races were held here at Delphi as at Olympia, according to Pausanias, with a wreath going to the victor of each competition. These started soon after 591 BC and were held every 4 years until the 390s CE, when the entire sanctuary, including the oracle and the games, was closed by the same order of Theodosius that closed down Olympia. 184 Chapter 11 PPPP. Athens also has a stadium, but it is modern rather than ancient, used in both 1896 and 2004, the only 2 times that the modern Olympics have been held in Greece. The city did not play host to any such games in antiquity, though it too had a patron deity, Athena, just as Olympia had Zeus and Delphi had Apollo. Rather, Athens saw the birth of momentous innovations, including the invention of democracy, and was home to philosophical giants such as Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. The Acropolis, or high point of the city, is justifiably famous and was named a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1987. Greek excavators, and Germans as well, including Wilhelm Dörpfeld, uncovered the remains of the buildings here beginning in the 1800s, including the Parthenon, the Erechtheum, and the diminutive Temple of Athena Nike, in addition to numerous marble statues and inscriptions. It is from the Parthenon that the so-called Elgin marbles came, removed by Lord Elgin and sent to England by 1805, ending up in the British Museum a decade later. The Greeks are still trying to get them back. The archaeologists also uncovered remains on the slopes of the Acropolis, including the theatre and the Odeon, some dating from as late as the Roman period but now in use again today for dramatic performances put on by local and visiting artists. It is the Agora, or marketplace, however, that was daily visited by more Athenians, since it was downtown Athens and the heart of the city. This is where the law courts were, as well as some of the most important buildings in the city, including the Bouleuterion, where the Senate met, and the Tholos, where the executive committee of the Senate met in private, the Metruon, where the archives were kept, various stoas, and other major administrative and legislative edifices. It also was where many commercial shops were located, as appropriate for a marketplace, and served as a meeting place for the citizens, including Socrates, among others. The Hephaestion, a major temple to Hephaestos, that was excavated by the Germans in the 1890s, overlooked everything at one end of the Agora. As befits such a major downtown area, it was almost always changing, so that the Agora of the 5th century BCE looked quite different from that of the 1st century CE, in terms of buildings and layout, though its basic function remained the same throughout. From DISCUS Throwing to Democracy 185. The Agora has been under almost continuous excavation since 1931 by the American School of Classical Studies in Athens, and the activity here reflects changes in techniques and technology during the past 85 years. The archaeologists have uncovered all the buildings mentioned in the preceding overview, as well as the streets and paths along which Pericles and Socrates walked, with much more still to be found. The newest excavations now utilize a software program called iDig, for use on the iPad, which was invented by Bruce Hartzler, the technological guru of the excavations. With this specialized program, which moves beyond the off-the-shelf programs used by the excavators at Pompeii several years earlier, the Agora archaeologists can record the excavation data even more quickly, easily, and accurately in real time. The area is still heavily populated, of course, with modern shops, restaurants, and houses in one of the busiest parts of Athens, at the foot of the Acropolis. Before the archaeologists can excavate anywhere, therefore, they have to purchase the houses and other structures that are currently standing in the area where they intend to dig. Under the successive directorships of T. Leslie Shear Sr. Homer Thompson, T. Leslie Shear Jr., and now John Camp II. Some 400 houses and other buildings have been purchased and demolished, with subsequent excavation done beneath them. The excavators must then proceed carefully through the layers of stratigraphy, working backward through time from the Ottoman period to the Byzantine period and then the Roman period before reaching the levels of classical Athens and eventually the Bronze Age. Excavating every summer, the archaeologists have slowly and carefully revealed the history of this most famous marketplace. They have found boundary stones that mark the edge of the area, each inscribed quite literally, "I am the boundary of the agora," as well as buildings known from the writings of ancient authors across the centuries, including the altar of the 12 gods, the monument of the eponymous heroes, the Stoa of Attalos, and perhaps even the house of Simon the Cobbler, and the prison in which Socrates was held during his trial for corrupting the youth and not believing in the gods. This also is the birthplace of democracy, and so it is not surprising that the archaeologists have found ballot boxes and the actual bronze. 186 Chapter 11. Ballots themselves, which could be held between thumb and forefinger until deposited in the ballot box, so that nobody else could see how you were voting. They also have recovered allotment machines used to choose jurors for trials, water clocks used to time speeches, and inscribed potsherds that were used when voting to remove someone perceived to have grown too strong and influential in politics, thereby giving rise to our term ostracism. Many of these are now housed in the Stoa of Attalos, which was reconstructed in the 1950s, using the same type of materials as the original, and which now serves as the museum for the site. The Agora also happens to be where I was a young and eager volunteer team member in 1982, during the summer between college and graduate school. For the policy during the past couple of decades has been to use team members who are upper-level college or graduate students intent on a career in archaeology. I didn't know it at the time, but there were at least 12 other volunteer team members working with me that summer who are now also senior archaeologists. I had the privilege of digging in the Stoa Poikile, the painted stoa, which had first been detected and identified a year or so earlier. In antiquity, this building had been famous for the large paintings with which it was decorated. They were still in place when Pausanias came through, 600 years after they had first been installed, but are now long gone, of course. I also had the dubious, but literally cool, thrill of excavating in an ancient well next to the painted stoa. This involved stripping down to only shorts and donning a bandana for my head and then being lowered via a bucket, as if I were going down for water. Once at the bottom, I stepped out of the bucket into an ooze of muck and began to dig straight down in a very narrow and claustrophobic area into which I barely fit. I, and other similarly small diggers, spent many hours squatting in that soggy environment over the course of the season, carefully excavating intact vessels, sherds, and other artifacts that had either accidentally fallen in or been deliberately tossed in as garbage long ago, and retrieving them from the mire in which they had been preserved. Excavating in downtown Athens is a novel experience, for at any given moment there are dozens of tourists watching your every move through the chain-link fence high above the excavation area. Revenge. From DISCUS Throwing to Democracy 187. Come swiftly, though, for each afternoon we were able to walk through the crowds in the Plaka on our way back home and have them magically part in front of us the entire way, because we were liberally coated with dirt or mud, especially if we had been digging in the well that day. It was a summer that still ranks highly as a unique experience among the more than 30 seasons that I have been in the field. PPPP. All three sites, Olympia, Delphi, and Athens, are known to anyone who has read about ancient Greece. Because of 2 centuries of archaeological work, it is possible to wander through the monuments at those sites and get a sense of what it might have been like there in ancient times. Apart from a few select buildings, however, primarily in Delphi and Athens, modern archaeologists have not reconstructed most of the ruined structures, and so the modern tourist must be actively involved and engaged at the sites in order to picture them as they once were. The 3 sites discussed here must suffice to represent all the others in classical Greece. They also represent the development of classical archaeology in this region as well, as it evolved from a search for statues and the location of famous sites to a scientific endeavor focused on asking and answering questions about the lives of ancient Greeks and their accomplishments. Everything else aside, though, it is simply an amazing feeling, sending chills down your spine, to sit in the same theater as did Euripides, stand inside Socrates' jail cell, visit the same temple to Apollo that held the Delphic oracle and Croesus's representatives, or run a race in the original Olympic Stadium. Archaeologists and archaeology have made all this possible. It may seem irreverent to quote Monty Python as a chapter title in an archaeology book, but we've already invoked Indiana Jones more than once, and, in any event, the answer that was promptly given in the 1979 movie Life of Brian was concise and reasonably accurate: sanitation, medicine, education, wine, public order, irrigation, roads, a fresh water system, and public health. Although the Romans may not have invented all of these things, they certainly spread them throughout a large part of the Roman Empire during the centuries of its existence, especially during the 1st century BC through the 5th century CE. They also brought us large-scale entertainment and arenas such as the Roman Colosseum in which to watch them. Archaeologists have found and excavated Roman ruins not only in Italy, of course, but also in England, France, Germany, Spain, and elsewhere in Europe, as well as Libya, Egypt, Israel, Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, and other parts of the Middle East, not to mention Greece, Turkey, and 1-2. What have the Romans ever done for us? What have the Romans ever done for us? 189. Cyprus. In 1986, for instance, I was part of a team excavating a Roman villa in Paphos, Cyprus. The villa, which dated to the late 2nd or early 3rd century CE, had been destroyed, apparently during an earthquake. The artifacts that we found attested that it must have belonged to a well-to-do owner. We found the skeleton of what was probably a young girl killed during this event, along with a single leather sandal, in one of the rooms. The most impressive feature in the house was an intricate and colorful floor mosaic in one room, which depicted Orpheus, a legendary Greek hero known for his musical skills, playing the lyre and surrounded by animals. It has now given its name to the whole house. Our work excavating the mosaic sticks in my mind, especially because of the difficulties involved in getting an overhead picture of the entire mosaic once we had finished revealing it, since it was almost 10 feet wide and 12 feet long. Because those were the days before drones, or even low-flying kites, were used regularly, our photographer had to climb a ladder and then walk out on a wooden plank that we had attached to the topmost rung, like a gymnast on a balance beam, while we held on to the entire contraption, so that he could be directly above the mosaic and get the desired overhead photographs. Picture yourself on a diving board at a swimming pool, standing on the very end and bouncing on it above the water, but holding a very expensive camera and taking photographs instead of diving in, and you'll get some idea of what it was like for him. Finds like this villa and mosaic in Cyprus have been discovered everywhere that the Romans established themselves, or where Roman influence was felt, from Europe to the Middle East and beyond. We have already mentioned in earlier chapters Roman period discoveries in London and at Troy, as well as Athens, Delphi, Pompeii, and Herculaneum. Later in this book we will have additional opportunities on several occasions to comment on the Roman finds at sites such as Masada, Megiddo, and the Dead Sea Caves in Israel, as well as Petra and Palmyra in Jordan and Syria. In this chapter, therefore, we will limit ourselves to a discussion of a few major monuments in Rome itself and muse on some of the problems involved when archaeology is used for nationalistic purposes. PPPP 190 Chapter 12. According to tradition, the twins Romulus and Remus founded Rome on April 21, 753 BCE. They were said to be descended from Aeneas, the prince who fled from the burning city of Troy 500 years earlier, as it was being sacked by the victorious Greeks at the end of the Trojan War sometime around 1250 BCE or a bit thereafter. The Roman poet Virgil tells us Aeneas's story in the aptly named Aeneid, which was written in the 1st century CE during the age of Augustus, Rome's first emperor. Virgil also mentions the twins several times. It is perhaps not surprising that the story of Aeneas is a bit suspect, since Virgil was trying to create a national epic for the Romans as Homer had earlier done for the Greeks with his Iliad and Odyssey. The story of Romulus and Remus also is highly suspect. We find the full details in the first book of Livy's History of Rome, which was also written during the reign of Augustus and can be seen as part of the same movement to glorify and legitimate Rome's first emperor. Livy said that the twins were abandoned at birth by the Tiber River but were found by a she-wolf who took them back to her lair and raised them as if they were her own pups. Later, a shepherd named Faustulus discovered them, brought them home to his wife, and raised them as his own children. Years afterward, while they were in the process of founding the city, Romulus killed Remus and named the city after himself, or so the legend goes. Livy's volumes cover Rome's history from its founding to his time. Much of what he says has been corroborated by archaeologists, including the discovery of primitive huts and other remains from the early 1st millennium BCE on the Palatine Hill in Rome. The story of Romulus and Remus that he relates, however, is a fairly typical rendition of what scholars call a foundation myth, which societies often use to explain how apparently ordinary individuals became rulers or leaders. We see similar tales told about Moses in the Hebrew Bible, as well as about Cyrus the Great of Persia and, much earlier, Sargon of Akkad, who ruled in Mesopotamia during the 23rd century BCE. All relate events that are open to question. Livy was not the only person who was enamored of Rome's history and who desired to trace a direct line from antiquity to the present, of course, be it the 1st century or the 19th and 20th centuries CE. In fact, the archaeological excavations done in Rome during much. What have the Romans ever done for us? 191. Of the period from 1870 to 1940, and the present state of many of the reconstructed ancient monuments, were undertaken in large part because of a desire to link past and present. Pope Pius VII initiated a program of excavation and renovation in Rome, beginning in 1803-1804. Work was done to uncover and conserve parts of the Arch of Septimius Severus, the Pantheon, the Arch of Constantine, and the Colosseum. These efforts continued even after Napoleon's conquest of Rome in 1807, with further work in a number of areas, including Trajan's Forum and the interior of the Colosseum. Work with a nationalistic agenda began in the years after 1870 by order of King Victor Emmanuel II, when the Colosseum and the Roman Forum, as well as a number of other ancient buildings and monuments and some famous sculptures, were either further excavated or simply cleared of rubble. Rome had recently become the capital of a unified Italy, just as it had once been the seat of the Roman Empire, and the king wanted the architecture, both ancient and modern, to reflect its newly reacquired status. Beyond that, much of what tourists see today was first uncovered by order of Benito Mussolini, the fascist dictator of Italy who came to power as prime minister in 1922 and who, 10 years later, declared, "I am Roman above all." In fact, the very word fascism, which Mussolini coined in 1919 to describe his political movement, comes from the Roman fasces, which were the bundles of wooden rods with an axe head protruding at one end that were carried around in antiquity to symbolize the power and authority of the Roman magistrates. As a visual representation of his revolution, of Rome's importance in the past and now the present, and of his vision of himself as a new Augustus, Mussolini adopted the image of the fasces as the symbol of his movement, after conferring with an archaeologist to get the image as accurate as possible. When he came to power, Mussolini was intent on recreating Rome as it had been during the time of Augustus, when that emperor transformed what had been a city of brick into a city of marble. In order to achieve this, Mussolini ordered that many of the ancient buildings should be excavated and that the various shacks, shops, and other modern or medieval buildings encroaching upon them be torn down. In this manner, under the supervision of an archaeologist named 192 Chapter 12. Corrado Ricci and others during the period from 1924 to 1938, the various additional forums, such as those of Julius Caesar, Augustus, and Trajan, were cleared, as was the Circus Maximus where horse and chariot races had been run. Ancient buildings and monuments were excavated, or further excavated in the case of the Colosseum and the Roman Forum, and some were reconstructed, such as the Ara Pacis, or Altar of Peace, of Augustus, as well as the Mausoleum of Augustus, the Theatre of Marcellus, the Pantheon, and various temples. New squares and wide streets, which showcased the newly excavated monuments, also were built. It has been said that the excavations conducted under Mussolini during those 14 years added more to our knowledge of Augustan Rome than the previous 14 centuries had provided. Mussolini took an active interest in these excavation and construction projects, even posing for a picture swinging a pickaxe as the demolition of encroaching buildings first began. In other photographs, he is shown with his entourage in front of the Theatre of Marcellus on the new Via del Mare and striding through the Piazza Bacca della Verita with the Arch of Janus in the background. Among the most famous is the photograph in which he is riding his horse in full regalia with the Colosseum in the immediate background, during the inauguration of the new Via del Imperio after its completion in 1932. The excavation of the Era Paces was particularly ingenious. The altar was originally begun in 13 BC and finished in 9 BC in order to celebrate Augustus's return after 3 years of fighting in Spain and Gaul, and the peace that he had brought to the empire. It was a gorgeous piece of work, freestanding and about 10 meters square, with sculptured friezes and relief panels on all 4 sides, including a personification of the goddess Roma herself, sitting on a pile of armor, and a depiction of the she-wolf suckling Romulus and Remus. Mussolini decided that he wanted it excavated and restored in time for a celebration of the 2000th anniversary of Augustus's birth, which was to be held on September 23, 1938. 10 pieces of the altar had been found accidentally as early as 1568, during the construction of the Palazzo Peretti, with 17 more fragments recovered in 1859. The latter were scattered in various museums and needed to be retrieved. In What Have the Romans Ever Done for Us? 193. Addition, the main part of the monument was still below the palace, both underground and underwater. Excavations in 1903 had uncovered another 53 pieces from the altar but had confirmed that the area was completely flooded. An archaeologist named Giuseppe Moretti and a hydraulic engineer named Giovanni Rodio led the excavation in 1937 and 1938. The team first stabilized and reinforced the walls of the palace that were above the ancient monument by injecting liquid concrete into the individual bricks. They then built a huge sawhorse, on which the palace walls could rest, and used hydraulic jacks to lift them up onto the supports. Next, they dug a 5-foot-wide trench around the entire area, ending up with a giant circle about 230 feet around and 75 feet across. They placed a pipe into this trench and attached to it 55 additional pipes, each 3 inches in diameter, and pushed them into the ground to a depth of 24 feet. By pumping carbon dioxide under pressure into the pipes, they were able to create a huge underground refrigerator and freeze solid all the moisture in the earth surrounding each pipe, thereby creating a circular wall of frozen earth 24 feet deep and 230 feet around. This served as a barrier prohibiting any more water from getting in. After pumping out the water that was already present within the area they had isolated, the archaeologists were able to excavate the remains, recovering 75 additional large pieces from the altar and hundreds of smaller fragments. They then reconstructed the altar in a new location near the Mausoleum of Augustus by combining these new pieces with those that had been recovered earlier and retrieved from the various museums. They finished just in time for the anniversary celebration of Augustus's birth, as Mussolini had wished. The altar and the area around it have since been renovated, with the most recent version being unveiled in 2006. In addition, several scholars have now called the reconstruction by Mussolini's archaeologists into question, suggesting that it was done hastily and not entirely accurately, with some pieces left out, others improperly joined, and the outer portion potentially being a later addition by Tiberius, the emperor who succeeded Augustus and who may have redone the original structure. PPPP 194 Chapter 12. Apart from the Era Paces, however, the most famous monuments that most tourists visiting Rome see today date from slightly later in the 1st century CE and the first half of the 2nd century CE, during the time of the Flavian dynasty and the period of the 5 good emperors, respectively. These include the Colosseum built by Vespasian and the arch built by his son Titus, as well as the column built by Trajan and the Pantheon completed by Hadrian. It was more than 80 years after the construction of Augustus's Era Paces that the Emperor Vespasian built his own temple to Peace, the Templum Pacis, in Rome. Commissioned in 71 CE and officially dedicated 4 years later, it was reportedly 10 times as large as the Era Paces. It was lost until relatively recently, but archaeologists conducting excavations from 1998 to 2000 uncovered the western corner of the temple, near the Forum of Nerva. The most famous part of this temple was a much later addition, built sometime between 203 and 211 CE specifically to hold a huge map of Rome inscribed on huge marble slabs, which was attached to the southeastern wall of the temple. Measuring more than 50 feet high and 40 feet wide, it is known as the Forma Urbis Romi, or, more colloquially, the Severan marble plan. It depicted the location of all the major buildings in the city that were present in the early 3rd century CE within an area stretching from the Tiber River all the way to south of the Colosseum, at a scale of about 1:240. It was torn down, and the pieces reused elsewhere in Rome, during the barbarian invasions in the tumultuous 5th century CE. More than 1,000 pieces of the map have been found by accident or by archaeologists since 1562, most recently in 2006, but it is still only about 20% complete. Vespasian had come to the throne as the 4th emperor in a single year, during the aptly named year of the 4 emperors in 69 CE. At the time, the Roman Empire was engaged in putting down a rebellion in what is now modern Israel, the First Jewish Rebellion, which lasted from 66 CE to 70 CE. Vespasian had been the Roman general in command of suppressing the revolt, leading the Roman troops against the rebels until he was recalled to Rome and installed as emperor. His accession to the throne marked the beginning of the Flavian dynasty. What have the Romans ever done for us? 195. For his 2 sons, Titus and then Domitian, succeeded Vespasian. In all, they ruled from 69 to 96 CE, one following the other as emperor.